Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. It's looking increasingly likely that Dillian Whyte will be the next on the Anthony Joshua hit list, should the unified champion get past Alexander Povetkin. In an interview with IFL TV, Eddie Hearn has made some very interesting statements that I want to quickly go through, and then I'll give my thoughts on. There's a lot going on there. So in respect of April the 13th, which is locked in as Joshua's next fight date at Wembley Stadium, Hearn stated, "Within 4 weeks of the Povetkin fight, if Joshua can win, we need to select his next opponent because of mandatory obligations and putting in requests for exceptions and stuff like that." Later on he said, "There is a very good chance that if Wilder does nothing, that we fight Dillian Whyte on April the 13th at Wembley." On the possibility of Joshua fighting Wilder, Hearn responded, "It's not ruled out. We've had no conversations." Hearn also stated, "If Joshua had his number one choice, I think it would be him over Wilder." I have to say, before seeing that interview, even though there was a bit of noise about Whyte being Joshua's next opponent, I wasn't completely sold that it would actually happen. But after hearing those statements from Hearn, it does sound like a deal will be done. He's saying that they need to announce the next opponent effectively by mid-October. But currently, there are no negotiations happening with Deontay Wilder. So, it's a bit hard to make a deal if you're not talking to them. And given protracted negotiations lasted for 3 months the first time around, between now and mid-October, there's effectively 6 weeks. And 6 weeks doesn't really feel like it would be anywhere near long enough to get a deal done. And we have to consider, right now, Deontay Wilder is preparing to face Tyson Fury at some point later this year. So he's unlikely to want to actually sign anything now, because the fact is, if he beats Fury and becomes the lineal champion, it's going to increase his commercial value and thus his negotiating power. So why would he want to give that up and sign anything now? It doesn't make sense. I'm sure some fans are going to hear Eddie Hearn mentioning the mandatory situation, and they're going to think instantly that it's a cover to make a fight with Whyte for Joshua to avoid Wilder. That narrative will take hold pretty quickly. And most likely, depending on which fighter you support, that's going to influence which side of the fence you sit on in respect of that debate. But in terms of the mandatory situation, that's actually one of the reasons I wasn't necessarily convinced a Whyte fight would happen in April. So the WBO, it's been out recently signalling it wants to call its mandatory soon. And the IBF mandatory, it's going to be due in a few months as well. So if Whyte and Joshua fight in April, it creates another logjam for the sanctioning bodies for their mandatory challenges. And right now, Joshua, he's only been fighting twice a year. So twice a year in 2017 and twice a year this year. So he'd be fighting Whyte in April, and then he would have to clear out the WBO and IBF mandatories before fighting the WBA mandatory in another 18 months' time or so. And bear in mind, this argument of Joshua fighting these fights is predicated on him continuing to win. And in some ways, if you got to a logjam with mandatories, it's a good situation to have in one respect because you've got a pipeline of fights. But at the same time, we have to ask the question, does it actually make the chance for an eventual undisputed fight less likely? It's hard to say at this point. But based on when Joshua has been fighting, you'd think that the earliest he would fight the WBC champion Wilder, if he also kept winning, would be in September or October next year. And by that time, the WBO and IBF will be begging for their mandatory challenges to face Joshua. And the mandatory obligations, they won't just disappear. There's going to be a point in which the sanctioning bodies get really bent out of shape about it all, and one of them will start threatening to strip a belt. And the IBF is the most likely candidate of the 4. Oh, well, 3 in Joshua's case, obviously, because he's only got 3 of the belts. But say it is Dillian Whyte for April. I like that fight. Obviously, both fought when they were fringe contenders in a hugely entertaining fight. It was full of drama and included Joshua getting rocked by a left hook. And obviously, fans remembered that punch for years. But ultimately, it did end with Dillian Whyte in a screaming heap on the canvas. Now that Dillian Whyte has been on a run of wins, including against Derek Chisora, Robert Helenius, Lucas Browne and Joseph Parker, he's built up a nice head of steam on the profile front. And Eddie Hearn will know that it's probably going to be about as good a time as any to cash in on what will be a lucrative rematch. There'll be a lot of hype. It'll be a big fight. And it's probably outside of Fury and Wilder, the next best cab off the rank to fight Joshua. I mean, you could argue Jarrell Miller, but outside of those four, who else on the scene at the moment is ready for that fight and can make a very big fight, at least in the financial sense, for Joshua, beyond other guys who've already had title shots? So Eddie Hearn, he probably knows it's about as good a time as any to have that rematch. And we have to remember it also doubles as an in-house fight, so all the money stays in-house. Given it's still not confirmed, and Joshua, he has to get past Povetkin, I'll hold off on thoughts on how it might play out and who'd win. But you could expect a fun fight. Dillian Whyte, he always turns up to fight. And Anthony Joshua, he really does want to fight Dillian Whyte again. He wants to prove that the first time round, because obviously it wasn't all one-way traffic, he wants to really put an exclamation point on a Dillian Whyte win. Interestingly though, even if Whyte was to fight Joshua, Hearn indicated that Whyte would still have a takeover fight later this year, and he hasn't ruled out that that fight would be in America. But the message was clear, Whyte is definitely fighting again this year. And Hearn, he also dropped in a few thoughts on Joseph Parker, saying Parker lost his fight to Dillian Whyte, but his stock still rose. And he said it's not as if he's gone backwards. I'm not sure I completely agree with that. But then he proceeded to talk about Parker, talking him up and saying that he's got an option on Parker's next fight. So surprise, surprise, why he's building him up, talking him up. Obviously, he wants to promote him at some point, potentially later in the year. But Dillian Whyte, he was also sort of talking about Joseph Parker in a very positive light. And he was also gassing up Robert Helenius, who he convincingly beat in October last year. He actually said Robert Helenius is a top 15 boxer, if you can believe that. And I've seen this before with Whyte, with these sorts of comments. He actually starts praising the guys that he's beaten. And the obvious reason is he wants maximum credit for those wins. But I digress. But certainly the signals coming from Eddie Hearn is a Dillian Whyte fight for Anthony Joshua. It's coming. And it's looking likely that April is that time. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.